So ladies and gentlemen, with the Indians, we had gotten to the point where Harmer went out and the Indians came together, and we mentioned the name Little Turtle. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. What happens, folks, is George Washington then sends an army. And folks, the army is very similar to like the proclamation. The army is supposed to try to keep the peace between the two groups of people, the Indians and the settlers. What happens, however, is the army is supposed to adhere to the law, basically, land stakes. Here's where the problem comes in. Settlers continued to violate the rules. Under the agreement, the army was supposed to then go into the Indian land and bring the settlers back. The Indians were not supposed to just kill them. That was creating frustration. Because if you're an Indian and time after time again, the settlers violate the rules, and then it takes time for the army to then come and relocate the people. Folks, what happens is there begins to become a dispute within the Confederation between Little Turtle and a man named Blue Jacket. Blue Jacket is more of a warrior class, more of a brave. Blue Jacket begins to believe that the army is not honoring the commitment. Blue Jacket believes that every time the settlers violate, it's because they don't respect us, they don't fear us. Blue Jacket begins to rally war. The only way the white man will learn is we must make them fear us. We must make us be respectful of us. And in the most simple terms, this of course leads to a battle. And the battle is called the Battle of Fallen Timbers. What we see is the Indians attack. The problem is Anthony Wayne has cannons. He has over a 3,000-man army. Simply, the Indians do not have that kind of resources. It is a very bloody battle on both sides, but as our question was already raised, the army wins the battle. Here is the item, and remember the other day we did Jay's Treaty? Folks, this was kind of that smoking gun proof. After the Battle of Fallen Timbers, when the Indians are defeated and they run, many of the Indians ran to a place called Fort Miami. Like if any of our, like in college football, Miami, Ohio, there's like a college there. That was the proof to Americans that the English had encouraged this, had supported this. Clearly the Indians were trying to seek safety. The Indians were trying to find a place to hide. Felt the British forts would be safe. Unfortunately for them, the British didn't really want to get involved. And ladies and gentlemen, what is the last item? Remember I said we would finish the problem? From all of this, and again, part of it is we argue the Indians attack. As much as we don't want to, we were not nice to Indians, there is some truth to that the Indians were the aggressor in the battle with the army. This leads to what is called the Treaty of Greenville. So folks, when you look at the Indians, the problem is land. Who gets Ohio? We fight the Battle of Fallen Timbers. We then make the Indians sign a treaty. And what is the big item? The Indians have to surrender Ohio. And at this point, this would begin to become Ohio, the future state. The Indians will then have to move into Indiana, Michigan, the Northwest Territory. But Ohio, this is what begins to set. And if you notice, by 1803, Ohio will become a state. So at this point, Ohio begins to start developing and settling. The other thing that we should mention is because of the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville, the 12 Indian tribe of the Confederation, they begin to bicker. They begin to bicker over why did we fail. They begin to bicker over should we have done something different. And some people would argue maybe the most important item is the attempt of the Indians to unite falls apart. So the Confederation itself fails, and the Indians going back to being very independent. In that case, ladies and gentlemen, what we are going to do next is I'd like to just give, these are not the problems, these are some basic items when Washington became president. They'll be very quick. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1789, Washington became the first president. For the rest of the year, what do you want to be aware of? With the exception of George Washington's first term, you are elected in an even year. 1980, 1860, 1864, 1824. You are elected in an even year, you take the oath of office the following March. So please be aware. Normally, you are elected in an even year, okay? you don't take the oath of office. So please be aware there's kind of a distinction. You have elections, and then normally the president, because there's a gap. Because you were elected in November, in the old days you didn't become president until March. Today, we shortened that time, the lame duck period, we shortened it that you become president in January. The first president, of course, is George Washington, and I hope for the goodness of everybody in this class you all knew that. The other thing you want to be aware of, folks, George Washington will become identified as a fascist. We will see, and one of the things you might want to go back, if you need to, folks, pick up your book. There is no place in the Constitution that it references political parties. Nowhere. So what we want to look at, folks, is by George Washington, we begin to see the emergence of parties. What is so amazing about Washington is he will fill his cabinet with people of both sides. The leader of the Anti-Federalists, Thomas Jefferson, is in his cabinet. The most renowned Federalist, Alexander Hamilton, is in his cabinet. So please be aware. You know how today, if a Republican wins, it's all Republicans. If a Democrat wins, it's all Democrats. Washington invited in people from both sides. Washington viewed his job as to try to come up with a compromise between the two people. The vice president became John Adams, so that is the first vice president of the United States. When you look at George Washington, what is the number one thing you want to recognize about him? Enormous dedication to duty. With George Washington, what you see is he is going to run on what is called, we're going to talk about this later, pomp and circumstance. George Washington is going to create the image of a leader. He is going to go to great lengths to make America look proud. He is going to spend a lot of his own personal money because he believes that image is important. For those of you who don't believe in that, think about, when you go into a business or something, do you want the people to, look greasy and grimy? Do you want the people in the business to have, their shoes off? And you may sound silly, but think about it. I mean, do you really want to go into a place and you're hiring a lawyer and, he's walking around in sweatpants? I mean, would it make you go, well, maybe I want something? The cabinet, and I do think under George Washington, and the reason you need to know his cabinet is because A, the cabinet was small, but more importantly, they're really famous. Ladies and gentlemen, the cabinet, this is one of the original laws by Congress, is we basically create a group of people to help the president. We created departments, and then there's the secretary of the department, like the Department of Defense, the Department of State, okay? So originally, the Secretary of State is Thomas Jefferson, and that would be the State Department. And if you don't know, the State Department largely is the group that deals with foreign nations. How are we going to deal with other countries? So Thomas Jefferson is the Secretary of State, and through much of early history, and that was part of the original accession, the Secretary of State is often looked at as kind of like a president in waiting. In the early part of our class, many Secretary of State go on to become the president, and that becomes a very common pattern. The treasurer, who will be very, very important, in fact, these two men are probably as dominant as Washington himself. The Secretary of the Treasury is Alexander Hamilton. Sometimes I assume you already know this. Thomas Jefferson is a rich, he was born into a very wealthy family. He is a Virginian. What is weird is Jefferson is an anti-federalist. Jefferson will later be called a Democratic Republican. Jefferson is a major advocate of democracy. Jefferson is an advocate of we must represent the people. Jefferson is an advocate of farming and agriculture. Hamilton is from New York. He was born in the West Indies. He came to America with probably a net value of less than $10. He is often looked at by IQ of probably being the brightest of the founding fathers. Basically had a job, and basically his boss offered to help pay for him to go to college. And how does he ever get, this poor, relatively unfamous man, get to anything? He was George Washington's personal aide in the Revolution. That is why Washington got to know him. After that, Alexander Hamilton married a woman named Schuyler, who was one of the richest and most popular or most famous families in New York. Why did a lot of people question this? Because she was like 20 years older than him. So a lot of people speculated that at this time in history, if you didn't come from a good family, you could never have power and prestige. So the argument was, did Alexander Hamilton marry this older woman so that he would have more of the chops of a family? Ladies and gentlemen, with Hamilton, remember, he did the Electoral College. Alexander Hamilton does not trust the poor. He believes the government must take care of the poor. Hamilton is the major advocate of the federal government, federal, 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 federal. Hamilton will be advocate of the North and specifically industry. And as I say this, folks, as our nation begins to divide, as we begin to have political parties, if you do not understand Jefferson and Hamilton, it won't make any sense. Hamilton will represent the northern viewpoint of industrialization. Jefferson will represent the southern viewpoint of agriculture. Jefferson supports rights, Hamilton supports federal rights. And again, Alexander Hamilton is a man who said, look what I became. The reason poor people are poor is they're lazy and weak and dumb and stupid, and they don't try to do anything. Thomas Jefferson, who was born into the lap of luxury, believed people need opportunity. So the rich man believed the poor person just needed some help. Alexander Hamilton looked at all the people that he grew up with and said, the reason they didn't become me is they didn't make anything. You are absolutely correct. When you look at them, they almost appear to be opposite in terms of, there is no doubt, Jefferson, when he becomes president, is an advocate for the people. Hamilton believed the people were stupid and dumb and cheap, and the job of the government is to make sure they're best taken care of. But the government should take care of people. Because, well, the reality was, most of you aren't smart enough to do it yourself. Next is the Secretary of War. I'm going to be honest, folks. With this group, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Washington, you will need to know. They will be on the test. We just have not gotten to that yet. But when you look at Hamilton and Jefferson are always going to disagree. So, for example, with England, Hamilton believes we should be friending. Jefferson hates England. Hamilton despises France. Jefferson likes France. Everything that one picks, the other is going to be the opposite. When it comes to the Indians, Hamilton believes the federal government should show authority. Jefferson probably would have believed it was a state issue. Let the state deal with their problem. Secretary of War is a man named Henry Knox. Does that name seem familiar to anyone? Fort Knox. And folks, that's about the only place you're going to see his name. And why does it make sense that George Washington uses this man the least? George Washington's specialty was general, right? He was a warrior himself. He doesn't need help. When it comes to the running, and I'm sorry, Hamilton is the treasurer, correct? Those areas, he wanted people who were good with money or people who were good with diplomacy. The last one was the Attorney General, and that's Edmund Randolph. That is the mainstream lawyer. And again, Edmund Randolph is a very wealthy, very prominent Virginian. And what are we going to sort of lose with him? Edmund Randolph is going to become a very negative anti-federalist, even maybe more so than Jefferson. An anti-federalist is a person who begins to believe the federal government is being too controlling, that the states need to have more power to be more of a buffer. Edmund Randolph. I said it the other day, but the first Chief Justice is John Jay. Remember, the biggest thing you notice is he resigns because there's not a lot of power here. The last item I'm going to mention at this point, before we divert for a minute, is the Judiciary Act of 1789. Some of you may think back. Remember, under the legislature, there is a list of 13 items Congress controls, okay? One of them is to create the lower court system. The Judiciary Act of 1789. One is it says that there are 13 district courts. For those of you who are really trying to be accurate and understand, district courts are trial courts. If you broke the law, this is where you would go, judge and a jury, the Fifth and the Sixth Amendment. Why 13? One per state. There were then, under the Judiciary Act, 3 circuit courts. And if you want to give yourself a hint, you can write the word appellate. Appellate court is if you believe that your case was improperly done. If you believe there is a mistake, you appeal to the appellate court. So if you think of it kind of like a ranking, district would be first, then circuit, and then above that would be the Supreme Court. The last item, actually 2, is in the Judiciary Act, we established that there would be 6 Supreme Court justices. And does anyone want to identify why that seemed odd? And ladies and gentlemen, honestly, I cannot even give you a good rationale of why they picked that. The only thing that would make sense is therefore you would have kind of more than a simple majority, but that is the original number. The last item I want to mention, because this will come important in a unit, in the Judiciary Act of 1789, they do once again mention judicial review. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, judicial review is the big thunder. It is the big power of the Supreme Court. What is the problem? It is not in the Constitution, and it has not been tested yet. Until the Supreme Court has judicial review, as John Jay said, the Supreme Court was worthless.